She stood in the middle of a grocery store parking lot, eyes wide and empty, clutching a can of soup like it was a lifeline. Behind her, a young cashier shouted something, maybe her name, maybe not, but the woman didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't even blink. A cold wind whipped her coat open, revealing a hospital wristband that no one had noticed until it flapped loose and caught the afternoon sun. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, low and sharp, and from the far end of the street, a shadow broke into motion. A German shepherd emerged from behind a gas station dumpster, not running, not frantic, just walking fast and straight like he already knew her. She did not move when he reached her. Instead, she looked down at him with the quiet recognition of someone seeing something she forgot she lost. He sat beside her like a statue, his breath steady, his eyes locked not on her face, but on the road behind her. She could not yet know that her name was Patricia, or that she'd once been known in 3 states for her apple pie and her gospel voice. She had no idea that 2 counties over, a man still set out 2 coffee cups each morning, waiting for a knock that never came. She certainly couldn't imagine that this dog, calm, battered, and unmistakably loyal, had spent nearly a year searching for her without a single command. The manager of the grocery store stepped outside, coat still unzipped, ready to yell at someone, anyone, until he saw her face. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, slow and unsure, like speaking too loud might shatter the spell of whatever this moment was becoming. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came, only a small sound, soft and cracked, like a bird testing a broken wing. The dog turned his head sharply toward her, ears twitching once, and pressed his shoulder gently against her leg like a pillar made of breath and warmth. She looked down at him again, blinked, and whispered a single word, unsure of why it came so easily to her lips, "Duke." The dog barked once, not loud, but enough to say, "Yes, I've been waiting, and we are not done yet." Someone in the store called an ambulance. Another person offered her water. But she only watched Duke, and Duke only watched the road. When the paramedics arrived and tried to lift her onto the stretcher, Duke growled, not to threaten, but to remind them who she trusted. One medic knelt, calm and careful, and said, "He can ride with her if he's calm, rules be damned." And so, with the dog lying beside her on the gurney, they rode into the unknown together, as the sun began to fall behind the town. Later that night, in a hospital room that smelled of lemon cleaner and winter air, she turned to the nurse and asked, "Why would a dog know my name?" The nurse dropped the coat. Not by accident, not from fright, but from the unmistakable feeling that what she had just touched wasn't meant for her hands. Her fingers had slipped into the lining while folding it, trying to make room on the narrow hospital shelf, when they brushed against something stiff and hidden. It wasn't just paper, no, it was thicker, heavier, like something that had weight not only in matter but in meaning and time. She looked over at Patricia, who was sleeping now, her breath shallow but even, with Duke curled tight against the bed like a wool blanket with eyes. Carefully, the nurse peeled back the thread at the coat's inner seam, thread that had clearly been opened before and sewn shut by an unsteady hand. Inside was an envelope, yellowed at the edges, marked in blue ink with 2 words that made her breath hitch, "To be remembered." She didn't open it. She couldn't. Some things, even in a job full of emergencies, deserve stillness and permission before they're disturbed. Instead, she sat beside the sleeping woman and placed the envelope on the bedside table, careful not to wake either of them, woman or dog. Duke stirred once, just enough to open one eye, scan the room, and return to that strange, ancient alertness only old dogs and soldiers possess. The next morning, Patricia awoke slowly, like someone returning from far away, her eyes searching the ceiling like it might whisper a name she couldn't recall. When she noticed the envelope, her hand reached for it before her brain seemed to understand why, some reflex older than understanding itself. The nurse watched quietly from the doorway, not moving, not speaking, just bearing witness to a moment that already felt heavier than the building around it. Patricia turned it over slowly, felt the edge with her thumb, then finally asked the question that had been rising in her throat since yesterday. "Why would a dog know my name?" The nurse stepped inside and replied, with the kind of voice reserved for church pews and children's secrets. Because this dog's been here before, 2 weeks ago, looking through windows, waiting by that bench outside, like he was sure you'd come back." Patricia blinked, lips parting slightly, then turned to Duke, who had already sat upright, staring at the envelope like he knew what it held. With trembling fingers, she opened it, the seal giving way not with a rip, but a sigh, like it had waited patiently for this exact moment. Inside were 3 things, a photo, a key, and a note written in the same blue ink that marked the outside. The photo showed her standing on the porch of a small house, one arm raised in greeting, the other holding Duke by the collar. The key was brass, old, worn smooth on one side, with a tag marked only with the number 214. And the note, in careful script, read: "If you find this again, it means you've forgotten. But if Duke is still with you, he remembers what I can't. Follow him." She stared at the note, blinking fast now, her breath catching as something deep within her stirred, not a memory, but the edge of one. The nurse knelt beside her and asked gently, "Do you want us to try and find where that key goes?" Patricia looked down at Duke, then out the window at the world that had once been hers and somehow still might be, and whispered, "Where does a dog go when he remembers something you don't?" The moment she stepped off the hospital curb, a car across the street slammed its brakes so hard the tires screamed against the cold pavement. The man behind the wheel didn't honk, didn't yell, he just stared through the windshield, jaw gone slack, eyes wide with something between shock and sorrow. Patricia froze, her hospital slippers crunching against gravel, Duke stepping protectively in front of her before she could even flinch, his body tense but controlled. The man stepped out slowly, not like someone chasing danger, but like someone approaching a ghost he'd already mourned, already buried, already given up on. His voice cracked before his words ever made it out, a low rasp, more breath than sound, shaped by disbelief that refused to settle. "Trish," he said, softly, like a name he'd said 1,000 times in prayer and not once aloud in 15 long years. She didn't answer, not because she was afraid, but because the name landed on her ears like a song half forgotten and half remembered. Duke didn't growl, didn't move, just kept his gaze fixed on the man's hands, as if judging whether memory or danger stood in front of them. The man's name, according to the ID badge clipped to his shirt, was Ben, and the logo above it read, Lou's Diner, Manager. He took one step closer, then dropped to a knee, not out of weakness, but reverence, eyes not on her face now, but on the dog. "I saw you too, just once," he said, eyes glistening, "you came through in that blue coat, always sat at booth 3 by the window." Patricia's eyes narrowed, something behind them stirring again, slow and thick like syrup over heat, memories not yet formed but no longer sleeping. "You brought apple cake in Tupperware," Ben continued, voice steadier now, "and told everyone it was your mother's, but the handwriting on the recipe said Trish." She blinked hard, her lips parting slightly, and she whispered without thinking, "Booth 3, with the crooked blind that let in the morning sun." Ben smiled, wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, and nodded slowly, as if she'd just walked through a locked door he thought sealed forever. "You said you were passing through, looking for someone," he added, glancing at Duke, "but I think you were running from something you couldn't name." Patricia sat down on the edge of the curb, the envelope still in her coat, the key warm in her hand like a slow heartbeat. "I don't remember who I am," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, "but I remember how the sun felt in that booth." Ben crouched beside her, careful not to get too close, careful not to shatter the fragile threads that were beginning to stitch memory back together. "I don't know where the key leads," she said, lifting it in the light, "but Duke seems to think he does." Ben leaned back on his heels and looked across the street to the diner, then to the far end of town where the old train depot stood. "Last time I saw you," he said, "you asked me how far a bus could take someone if they didn't care where they ended up." Patricia turned toward him slowly, her voice barely audible through the sudden lump in her throat, and asked, "Did I ever say who I was looking for?" Ben didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees like a man waking up from a dream he hadn't asked for. He motioned across the street with a tilt of his chin, then crossed without looking for traffic, as if pulled by something older than caution. Patricia followed with Duke beside her, his stride steady, his presence no longer just a comfort but a kind of compass wrapped in fur and memory. Inside the diner, nothing had changed, not the faded menus, not the humming light above booth 3, not even the crooked blind that let sunlight in sideways. Ben reached beneath the counter, pushed aside a metal tin of sugar packets, and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed at the edges and folded tight. "I kept this," he said, placing it gently on the table in front of her, not because I understood it, but because it felt like goodbye. She opened it with both hands, careful not to tear the fragile paper, her fingers trembling not from fear but from recognition she hadn't earned yet. Inside was a handwritten note in blue ink, same as the one in her coat, same careful cursive, same signature at the bottom ph. "If I don't remember me, maybe someone else will. If not, the dog will. He always does." She pressed a hand to her lips, tears threatening but not yet falling, and stared down at the looping script like it might unlock something if she stared long enough. Ben slid into the booth across from her, eyes soft, hands folded like a preacher waiting for a prayer he wasn't sure would ever come. "You came in late that night," he said, voice low and steady, soaking wet, coat torn, asking if I knew the name on your bracelet. Patricia looked down at her wrist, at the empty skin where a bracelet had once been, the imprint faint but still there like a bruise that forgot its cause. "You left that note," Ben continued, "and the dog, Duke, wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, just stared at the door until morning." She smiled faintly, then reached across the table and placed the photo from the hospital envelope beside the note, lining the pieces up like puzzle corners. "That's my house, isn't it?" she asked, not as a question of uncertainty, but like a woman seeing her reflection in a mirror for the first time. Ben nodded slowly, the image clearly matching something he had seen before, not just in the photo, but in the way she sat, the way she breathed. "I never saw the house," he said, "but the tag on the key, 214, that's a route number, not a door." Patricia leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the light warm her face, the dog's body pressed against her feet like a memory returned. "You were looking for a bus," Ben said again, "but I think what you needed was the road before the bus." She opened her eyes and reached for the key again, turning it over in her hand, her voice steadier now, like something inside had clicked into place. "I need to follow where Duke takes me," she said, as if just now understanding what the note had always been trying to tell her. Ben hesitated, then pulled a slip of paper from the register drawer, a receipt, faded and torn, with a scrawled address barely legible across the top. "You left this behind too," he said, handing it to her, "but it wasn't yours, it was in Duke's collar pouch, tucked behind his ID tag." Patricia read the address aloud, the words like stones dropped into deep water. "Miller's Crossing. Route 214. Station House." She looked up at Ben and asked, "What's at Miller's Crossing?" Ben dropped his coffee mug. It hit the floor without breaking, but the sound cracked something open in the air between them just the same. "Miller's Crossing," he said, eyes fixed on the receipt like it had just come alive and spoken his name with her voice, "that's where they lost you." Patricia blinked, unsure whether he meant the world, her memory, or something deeper, but the look on his face said everything, all three, and more. "I got a call that night," Ben continued, voice heavy now, thick with regret, from a pay phone near Route 214, a woman asking for help. He stood slowly, walked to the register drawer again, and pulled out an old journal with a cracked leather cover and a rubber band holding it shut. "I write things down," he said, almost apologetic, "not because I want to remember, but because I'm afraid someday I won't." He opened it to a page marked with a faded receipt and pointed to a time-stamped entry, April 6, 9:42 p.m., "She's gone. Dog's still here." "You'd been living in a train station," Ben said, "an abandoned one, Miller's Crossing Depot. Said you liked the sound of the wind through the rails." Patricia closed her eyes, something flickering behind them, not a memory exactly, but the shape of one forming like steam on glass. "There was a girl," Ben added, his voice catching now, "a young woman. She came looking for you. Said she was your niece, said you saved her." Patricia gripped the edge of the table. The words landed not as information, but as impact, like hearing your own eulogy read aloud by a stranger. She was crying, he continued, because the dog was the only one who hadn't left. He stayed at the depot like a statue. He walked to the window, staring out toward the long, straight line of road that led to where the rail tracks had been pulled up decades ago. She left a number. I called it twice. No answer either time. And then I buried the paper. Couldn't carry the weight of it anymore. Patricia stood, slowly, holding the key in her hand now like it belonged to something sacred, not a place, but a purpose. Miller's Crossing, she said again, her voice different now, more certain, as if the road itself had whispered a welcome back through the soles of her shoes. Ben turned, his voice rough, his eyes no longer hiding the storm behind them. They said you were gone, Patricia. That you'd wandered off and never came back. She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing Duke's head, the dog leaning into her hand with the calm certainty of someone who had always known otherwise. I didn't leave, she said, as tears finally found their way down her cheeks. I forgot how to come home. Ben placed the journal on the table beside her photo and the envelope, then stepped aside like someone making room at the altar. I think there's something waiting for you at that depot, he said, and I don't think Duke ever left it behind. Patricia looked down at the key again, then into the dog's eyes, and asked quietly. Duke, what did I leave behind at Miller's Crossing? The door was already ajar. Not wide open, not kicked in, just resting there with that kind of silence that felt like a held breath. Duke didn't hesitate. He stepped through first, his tail low but still, ears forward, moving not like he was exploring but like he was returning home. Patricia paused at the threshold, the key still warm in her hand, though she now understood it had never been meant for the front door. The depot air was thick and stale, the scent of dry wood and rust clinging to the walls like time had forgotten to carry it out. One window was broken, and the light that came through it landed square on a chair in the middle of the room, one she somehow recognized. She stepped inside, slow and steady, her hand brushing the frame as though touching the wood might stir the memories that hovered just beyond her grasp. There was something written on the wall, faded beneath a layer of dust and charcoal soot, a name carved with slow, uncertain strokes. Patricia was here. Waiting. She reached toward it, touched the edge of the final letter, and pulled her hand back like it burned, not from heat, but from recognition. Duke turned left, toward the back storage room, nosing the frame of a small door that had been sealed with a bent nail and an old belt. Patricia crouched beside him, pulled the belt free, and opened the door into darkness, her breath hitching as the smell of old rain and paper spilled out. There, under a tarp that hadn't been moved in years, were two things, a duffel bag with her initials stitched into the side, and a shoebox. She opened the duffel first. Inside were clothes, folded neatly, a Bible with her name in gold, and a photograph of a young girl holding Duke's leash. The shoebox trembled in her hands as she opened it, and inside, wrapped in tissue, was a music box and a baby's hospital bracelet marked L. Halford. Her knees gave out before she knew she was falling, and Duke leaned into her side before she hit the floor, steadying her like a lighthouse in a storm. She clutched the bracelet, the initials burning through her like fire and ice all at once, her breath coming in short gasps between rising sobs. There was a child, she whispered, not in question, not in panic, but in the reverent awe of someone remembering something too sacred to ever forget. She turned the music box key slowly, the lullaby creaking out, and with it came the echo of a voice, her voice, singing the same tune. Lydia, she said, the name hitting the air like it had always been there, just waiting for her breath to carry it again. Duke laid his head in her lap, his eyes closing slowly, as if to say, yes. That's what we came for. She pressed the bracelet to her heart, rocking slightly, not weeping now but whispering, over and over, as if saying the name would bring her home. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, hesitant, slow, but not uncertain, and a silhouette filled the doorway behind her as the last note of the lullaby played. A voice, quiet and young and scared, spoke behind her. Are you the woman from the picture? Patricia turned sharply, breath caught mid-chest, the bracelet still clutched in her hand like a lifeline pulled from drowning water. A girl stood there, no more than 17, maybe 18, with long auburn hair and eyes that looked like they belonged to someone Patricia once was. The girl didn't flinch, didn't speak again, just took one careful step forward, her eyes darting down to Duke, then to the bracelet in Patricia's hand. "I found that box 2 years ago," the girl said softly, when the wind knocked the tarp off and the roof finally gave in. Patricia's lips parted, but the words didn't come, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and a prayer she didn't remember how to finish. "I didn't know who you were," the girl continued, taking another step closer, "but I carried that photo for months like it was a map." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn, folded copy of the same picture from the duffel, only this one had a phone number scribbled across the back. "I asked every station manager between here and Galveston," she said, voice trembling now, "until someone remembered the dog. They always remembered him." Patricia stared, not at the girl's face, but at her hands, slender fingers, bitten nails, the same nervous tapping her own hands used to do. "Your name," Patricia breathed, the words barely forming, "tell me your name, please." The girl nodded slowly, like she knew this question had waited its whole life to be asked. "Lydia," she said. "I was in foster care as a baby. The woman who raised me said I was found on a church step with a dog collar and a music box." Patricia's knees buckled again, but this time she didn't fall. Duke leaned in hard, his body like a railing she didn't know she still had the right to lean on. "I don't remember how I lost you," Patricia whispered, tears falling now in slow, steady rivers, "but I remember why I hid you, and why I ran." Lydia stepped closer, her eyes glistening, voice shaking now with emotion she hadn't planned to show. "Did you leave me on purpose?" she asked, and it wasn't an accusation, it was a child's last unanswered question echoing across 17 years of silence. Patricia shook her head, slowly, her hand still over her heart, her voice cracking like frost-splitting bark. "I left you with everything I had left, which wasn't enough to raise you safe, but just enough to make sure you'd survive." Lydia knelt beside her now, resting a hand on Duke's back, her other hand gently touching the bracelet still pressed to Patricia's chest. "I kept that collar," she said, voice soft, "because I thought if I found him again, he'd take me back to whoever I belonged to." They sat like that, woman, girl, and dog, in the dusty light of the depot, while the weight of lost years dissolved into something softer than grief. Finally, Lydia reached into her coat again and pulled out a folded letter, aged and stained at the corners, her fingers trembling as she offered it. "This was under the floorboard in my foster mother's house," she said, "I think. I think you wrote it the night you disappeared." Patricia unfolded the letter slowly, each word unraveling her like thread from a too-tight sweater, until she reached the final line, which she read aloud. "If someday you find this, if someday you remember me, come home. Come find the dog. He never forgets." Patricia looked at her, at the girl who was no longer just a shadow or a memory, and asked through the tears, "Do you want to come home now?" Lydia didn't speak, not right away, not even as Patricia reached for her hand with fingers trembling like a church bell after lightning. Instead, she stood, walked to the edge of the depot's broken platform, and looked down the track line swallowed by weeds and rusted silence. "I dreamed about the house for years," she finally said, her back still turned, voice even but barely holding back the sound of something breaking loose inside. "I saw a porch light in the dark, always warm, always flickering, but no matter how close I walked, I never got there." Patricia came up beside her, quietly, the music box still in her hand, her words slow and fragile, like someone reciting their own eulogy aloud. "That light was real," she said, eyes fixed on the horizon, "and if Duke remembers the road, then I believe the door still stands." Duke rose then, stretched without hurry, and began walking without command, past the rails, through the fence, and down a gravel path hidden from most maps. They followed him in silence, just the three of them, through the lengthening afternoon as the sky dipped into gold and the trees whispered old prayers. The road led past fields and crumbled barns, past towns without names, through a world that seemed to pause just to let them pass through. And then, at the edge of a clearing where the oaks bowed low and the wind changed direction, they saw it. A white farmhouse stood leaning gently to one side, porch crooked but whole, paint chipped and weary, but windows intact and glowing with late summer light. Lydia stopped at the gate, the same gate from the photo, her hands gripping the top rail like it might tell her a story if she listened hard enough. Duke walked up the porch steps, turned once at the door, and sat, not scratching, not barking, just waiting like someone returning with company. Patricia's breath caught in her throat as she stepped onto the porch, her hand resting on the banister she once painted green with a baby on her hip. She reached into her coat, pulled out the brass key marked 214, and held it toward Lydia with a hand steadier than her heart. "This house was yours before it ever knew me," she said, eyes locked on the girl's face, "and it never stopped calling you home." Lydia took the key slowly, eyes wet now, chest rising with the deep inhale of someone finally ready to step into the story they were written for. She unlocked the door, the old bolt clicking like a heartbeat settling into rhythm, and pushed it open to a scent of dust, lilacs, and thyme. The first thing they saw was the photo, framed and faded, of Patricia holding baby Lydia, taped to the wall beside the kitchen table. The second was Duke's old bed, mended and patched, but still shaped like he'd just stepped away for a moment. Lydia dropped her bag, turned toward Patricia, and asked through tears, "Why did I feel like someone was always waiting for me here?" Duke began to scratch, not aimlessly, not out of boredom or instinct, but with a focused urgency against the far corner of the kitchen floor. The sound of claw on wood echoed sharply, not frantic but deliberate, like a clock striking at the precise moment something must finally be revealed. Lydia rushed over first, crouching beside him, her fingers gently brushing the edge of the floorboard now worn soft beneath his paws and years of waiting. Patricia remained at the doorway, one hand still resting against the frame, her eyes locked not on the wood, but on the dog's unwavering posture. Without a word, Lydia wedged her fingers beneath the loose board, lifted it carefully, and drew in a breath that came out as a shaky whisper. Tucked beneath the plank was a sealed envelope wrapped in plastic, yellowed only at the corners, but otherwise untouched by time, water, or memory. Duke stepped back, lay down, and rested his head on his paws, not tired, not watching, just still, like his part in this chapter was done. Patricia took the envelope from Lydia's hands slowly, turning it over as if the weight of it might suddenly shift and pull her down with it. Written in ink the color of dusk, on the front in her own unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words that hit harder than thunder, "To my grown daughter." Her fingers trembled as she cracked the seal, unfolding the pages inside like one might hold a life they had long since believed was lost. She cleared her throat, sat down at the table, and read aloud with a voice both broken and mending at once. "If you're reading this, it means the world has brought you home, or maybe Duke did, which means I was right to trust him." Lydia stood beside her now, one hand on the back of the chair, the other pressed tightly against her chest as if holding herself in place. "I couldn't raise you where I was going, and I couldn't protect you from the things that made me run. But I could leave pieces behind, not just photographs and names, but truth, written with my whole heart in case my memory failed before I found you again." Patricia stopped reading, just for a moment, because the tears had finally made their way down her cheeks, slow, silent, and full of grace. Lydia didn't cry. She only leaned closer, as though each word was a lantern being lit along the path she'd walked blind for years. "You were never unwanted. You were the only thing I ever did right. And if the stars were kind, you'd find this letter with Duke by your side." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was sacred, the kind that settles in only after the truth has been spoken in full. Patricia folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her lips, then held it out to Lydia with the reverence of someone offering something living. Lydia took it, hands steady now, her voice firm and full of something new, not grief, not confusion, but belief. "She never left me," she whispered. "She left for me." Patricia nodded once, her eyes locked on Duke, who had now closed his eyes with the deep breath of a soul at rest. Then Lydia turned and asked, voice trembling not from fear but from the weight of a new beginning. "What do we do with the rest of it, the house, the story, and all this time between us. The front porch light flickered on by itself, not from motion, not from a switch, but from a timer that had never stopped ticking. Both women turned at the same time, hearts pounding for different reasons, watching the glow spill across the yard like memory pouring through an open door. Lydia reached out and took Patricia's hand without hesitation, her fingers no longer unsure, no longer searching for permission or explanation. Patricia smiled through tears that felt like rain after a dry season, her voice steady, calm, and wrapped in the warmth of something whole again. "We rebuild it," she said, eyes fixed on the house, not as it was but as it could be, and we live like we were never lost. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees like applause, soft and full of blessing, as Duke stood and stretched, then walked to the steps without a sound. He sat again, not watching the road this time, but watching them, as if this moment, not the journey, had been the purpose all along. Lydia stepped outside first, calling down the driveway, her voice rising with certainty she hadn't felt since childhood. "He's here." He brought her back. Within 20 minutes, the first truck rolled into the gravel, then another, followed by a familiar old sedan with Ben behind the wheel, eyes wide. Neighbors climbed out slowly, unsure of what they were walking into, until Duke trotted toward them and sat, giving one soft bark and a wag of approval. Someone gasped. Someone whispered. Someone else started crying. Then a woman stepped forward, gray-haired, floral blouse, cane in hand, and said, "That's Patricia Halford. I'd know her anywhere." Patricia stepped down the porch, met the woman halfway, and took both her hands, whispering, "I didn't mean to leave. I just forgot how to return." By dusk, folding chairs appeared on the lawn, old radios played gospel beneath the trees, and a boy brought peach cobbler without being asked. One by one, they came forward, not for answers, not for explanations, but to say her name again like it belonged to the earth. The mayor arrived late, holding his hat in his hand, and offered the deed to the house with a shaking voice and a single apology. "We never should have stopped looking," he said, eyes lowered, "and we should have listened when the dog stayed after the storm." Lydia stood beside Patricia, one arm looped through hers, the other holding the music box, which played faintly in her coat pocket. "I don't need to leave again," she said, voice full of quiet strength, "not when this is where the story finally finishes." That night, beneath the stars, they buried the letter beneath the front porch, sealed in a cedar box with Duke's old collar and a pressed flower from Lydia's first bouquet. When the morning came, Duke lay curled in the doorway, not in pain, not in sleep, just still, as if resting after a duty fulfilled. He didn't move when they called his name. He didn't have to. They buried him beneath the apple tree behind the house, wrapped in the quilt from the duffel, a stone placed gently at his head. It read, "Duke, he carried the memory." And every Sunday, Patricia sat in the rocker by the window, Lydia beside her, the house full of light, and the front porch warm with voices. Sometimes strangers still came, asking for directions, and Patricia would smile and say, "If you follow the dog's road, you'll always find your way home."